Hey everyone, Cody here. Just wanted to drop in before the episode started and let you know that the original plan was to do chapters 9 and 10 together. And once we hit the 5.5 hour mark of talking, we decided it would be best to split these into two episodes. So we've got this chapter 9 episode, which will end, unfortunately, without the usual quotes, funny parts, most Pynchon part. That will all be in chapter 10. Apologies for that if anyone was looking forward to that, but we just had to make the choice to split these into two episodes. So the announcement for our guest host for the wrap up of part one will also be at the end of the chapter 10 episode. So make sure you stick around for that because it's a pretty big one this time. And thanks so much for listening. Hope you enjoy.
Hello, and thank you for joining us in Mapping the Zone, a podcast dedicated to a highly fixated review of large, dense books, specifically of the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. My name is Kate, and I'm one of the co-hosts.
My name is Cody.
And I'm Will.
And we are going to be down Luke this week, but he should be rejoining us pretty soon. He's been doing some traveling, which is exciting. This is also some inside baseball. This is our third attempt to record this episode of the show. It seems that we have one cursed episode per season that we do this for. There was that one that we had to record like 4 times with Mason and Dixon. There was that episode that just we completely lost the recording of because everything was garbled, and I think that was Bleeding Edge. So it's nice to know that we got this one out of the way now, and right. and have for the most part 2 years of really solid recording ahead of us.
Smooth sailing from here.
Yeah, but both me and Cody got sick during our original time that we were supposed to record this, and like my voice was completely fucked. And then for some reason, the second time we tried to record, my computer just decided it wasn't going to recognize the Wi-Fi in my own home. And now finally everything is back to normal, and third time's the charm, I suppose.
As normal as it can be for us, yeah.
Yeah, that's true. This week, we are going to be discussing chapters 9 and 10, comprising pages 97 through 118 of Against the Day. What did you guys think about these two chapters? They're both pretty different from one another.
Yeah, they really are. I really enjoyed both of them. I think chapter 10 might be my favorite section of this first part of the book. I think that a lot of the imagery that takes place and the way that everything kind of is pushing towards this this kind of high action, I almost want to say a cliffhanger in a Pynchon book in a way, I guess, but it really ramps up the tension and it ramps up the stakes and the intrigue going into part 2, and I think it makes for some really compelling reading. The chums come back, and I know that the chums are a very divisive part of this book. I love them personally.
Are they really?
They really truly are. A lot of people do not like the book specifically because of the chums. And I think part of that, and we can talk about this when we get to chapter 10. I think a part of it is that they are being taken too seriously by some readers, and they're not seeing them for what they are, that they are caricatures and that they are a parody of those boys' adventure novels. And I think maybe if you just weren't familiar with that genre, or you never really engaged with that genre, it might not hit the way it was intended to hit. But I did grow up on these books, and so I love seeing it sent up in the way that it is, and not just sent up, but also there's a loving kind of homage that it's playing into as well. It's it's very carefully done, and it's a lot of fun, and I like those characters a lot. But yeah, I think I love chapter 9. There's a lot of really interesting goings on, and there's some really heavy emotional scenes, especially towards the end when Kit and Webb are kind of having it out regarding Kit's decision. So they're both really, really good chapters. I really enjoy both of them.
Yeah, I really enjoy these chapters too. You know, we talked a lot about like the Hollow Earth stuff with Mason and Dixon for obvious reasons, and a lot of the kind of conversations that we got into thematically around that was some of my favorite stuff that we talked about. in that book, and it's something that like has continued to be a theme. We talked about it a bit in Bleeding Edge, and now obviously it comes up in chapter 10, which is great. So I'm sure that all three of us have plenty of stuff to talk through in relation to that. So I was excited to see some of that thematic stuff brought back up, especially because it was one of the few things I knew what was going to get brought back up at some point in this book. I wasn't expecting to be this early, and I'm sure there's probably more of it later on down the line, but I was surprised it showed up, at least for the first time this early in the book. It was also nice, to me anyway, to get back to the Chums of Chance, because they really do disappear there for like 75, 80 pages after they're introduced in those first couple of chapters.
Yeah.
And their continuing sort of existence as storybook characters I just find that really fascinating, especially in that chapter, in that like the narrator or the author of those books inserts themselves and talks directly to the reader, which is something that we've talked about as like Cherry Coke potentially being Pynchon, or other sort of people being stand-ins for Pynchon. It's interesting to see him do that like in a very one-to-one way that is sort of unmistakable. Whether or not, obviously, like Pynchon himself is the narrator of those novels, or the writer of those novels, it's just nice to see him lean into that aspect of his books. And then, chapter 9 is another piece of just excellent family writing, just the relationship between Kit and his father, and the way that whole thing gets wrapped up with by the end of that chapter. It's really engaging material. It's interesting from like, there's a lot of historical references that are very real in that chapter that kind of give you an idea of some of the development of like electricity and mathematics and all of that. But then also it's tied together with that same devastatingly realistic familial portrait that he continues to paint in his post Gravity's Rainbow novels. And it hits close to home as someone who has an estranged relationship with their father in a way that I don't think I was expecting.
Yeah, that seems, it's pretty powerful.
Yeah.
Going to change the tone slightly from the heartfelt. I really do love these two chapters, though. First of all, in like a roller coaster kind of sense, they are a real final few clicks of the ratchet before the big drop kind of vibe. And the way that they depict Foley Walker, I guess, courting Kit's, agreement to the offered deal, just really effective writing, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Because Foley Walker is kind of, from a character standpoint, a bit of an enigma. As much as we learn about him, he's still, by the end of the book, at least as far as I feel, still very much kind of a hazy person. Just seeing him endear himself is a fascinating thing. And the second chapter of this section, the chapter 10, is so vast, and I love the conjunction of both of the chapters, because you get the first really explicit discussion of the pure mathematics and the abstract geometry from the standpoint of Kit learning about electricity in chapter 9. And then you just get to see the ideas blown up into like kind of the epitome of it, as Wikipedia frames this whole book, the peak of historiographic metafiction. Like, I mean, writ large in both a literal and figurative sense through that chapter. And I love that experience of trying to follow along with that. It's so interesting, the amount of political material that Pynchon's able to dig out of these purely mathematical ideas. So I'm a big fan of these chapters as well, but for less attached reasons, I guess.
Sure. Chapter 9, if we start to get into the sort of actual detail of the chapter, starts with a rather interesting 4th of July evening in 1899, in which case there is a magnetic event that is described very, very, very humorously, where it says, "But that night there was man-made lightning, horses gone crazy for miles out into the prairie, electricity flooding up through the iron of their shoes that when they finally came off and got saved to use for cowboy quoits, including important picnic tourneys from Fruita to Cheyenne Wells, they would fly directly and stick onto the spike in the ground, or to anything else nearby made of iron or steel. That's when they weren't collecting souvenirs on their way through the air. Gunmen's guns came right up out of their holsters and buck knives out from under pant legs. Keys to traveling ladies' hotel rooms and office safes, miner's tags, fence nails, hairpins, all seeking the magnetic memory of that long ago visit. Veterans of the rebellions fixing to march in parades were unable to get to sleep. Metallic elements had so got to humming through their blood maps. Children who drank the milk from the dairy cows who grazed nearby were found leaning against telegraph poles, listening to the traffic speeding by through the wires above their heads, or going off to work in stockbrokers' offices where, unsymmetrically intimate with the daily flow of prices, they were able to amass fortunes before anyone noticed.
It's like a Looney Tunes thing. It
is
beautifully written, but so absurd.
In fact, I'm pretty sure there are multiple Looney Tunes cartoons in which a giant magnet is used to pull guns away from people.
Yeah. Giant magnets are fun.
They are. Especially when you get two really powerful ones and then you can't really like separate them. You have to like fight the magnets to get them apart again. We learn that this sort of electromagnetic event is the direct result of Kit Travers working on an experiment with Tesla. This is a piece of real history, not necessarily the guns and knives and stuff flying through the air, but Tesla did find himself in Colorado Springs between 1899 and 1900. I did like a little bit of research on it. Cody, I know you're a big Tesla guy. He wasn't the most sane individual in a lot of respects.
Pretty generous, yeah.
He was kind of crazy, and sometimes he just sort of did stuff.
Yeah.
And drew wild conclusions from just doing stuff. And his presence in Colorado Springs is certainly one of those. He was in Colorado Springs from May of 1899 to January of 1900 because apparently he was curious about the region due to its frequent thunderstorms, high altitude, and then the dryness of the air. He was wondering if through the study of low pressure air that he could do telegraphy experiments by sending signals basically off of Pikes Peak to other parts of the world, if I understand correctly. His lab in Colorado he wanted to build because it would give him space to use much larger Tesla coils than he had used up to that point. In one test during this period, he managed to get a arc to come off of his Tesla coil that was 135 feet in length. It was so large that it actually burned out the power generator in El Paso that he was using to power this station that he had built. Like, he had struck a deal with the municipal government of El Paso to use their electricity. And the entire city of El Paso lost electricity that was powering, the modest stuff that they had at that time as a result of this giant arc that he had gotten.
Just for context, that's over 500 miles.
Yeah.
It is 566 miles between those two cities.
I was surprised that he needed to go that far for any sort of like deal for electricity, but I would imagine that there wasn't much other like giant hubs that he could probably go off at the time.
No, and I think that area was still relatively pretty open as far as land usage and everything that he could, build out as much as he needed to.
I think the funniest part about, and this is where you get into, as Cody said, a fairly generous interpretation of Tesla as being like pretty crazy, in that he had great ideas, like his idea for wireless electricity, for example. But then he would do stuff like this, and he raised the funds to build this lab in Colorado from a man named John Jacob Astor IV. He got John Jacob Astor IV to invest $100,000 in the Tesla Corporation. That Tesla misled John Jacob Astor IV in thinking that the money would be used for the creation of his wireless electricity system. But instead, he just used it to do this weird shit in Colorado. He never had to recoup that investment because John Jacob Astor IV would then go on to die in the Titanic shipwreck.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and he actually was the richest man on that boat. So Tesla managed to scam a very rich man out of $100,000 into an experiment that convinced him he could use the Earth as a basically an electrically conductive like system or circuit. His observations of the electronic noise, quote unquote, of lightning strikes made him incorrectly conclude that he could use the entire globe to conduct electrical energy. I think, Will, it was you that made a reference to this when we were talking about Tesla originally, when his name first got brought up in this book. And so that this point in his career that's mentioned in the book is where he came up with that crazy idea. He also at the time picked up unusual signals in his receiver that he thought may have been alien transmissions from another planet. And based off of like no information at all, he just picked Mars as the place where they were probably coming from. He then wrote an article about these like things that he intercepted. Modern researchers, with the benefit of like hindsight and more history, think that actually what he did was pick up on Marconi's European radio experiments in July of 1899, where he was successfully communicating with naval ships using Morse code. And so he, for some reason, went, "Oh my God, I'm picking up these random radio signals. It must be Martians." After he had this whole weird theory about the Martians, he published in the articles I read about this literally called it a difficult to understand, mostly philosophical treatise on his experiments in Colorado that was published in Century magazine. This article itself had very little science in it, but was a quote philosophically imagined wireless system he wanted to build. The publisher was so excited about publishing something from Tesla that he sent a photographer, and the images captured at that lab in Colorado Springs are some of the most famous of Tesla, including one particular photo where he's sitting in a chair reading a book, and there's a giant 35-foot like electrical arc coming off of one of the Tesla coils. It's a very famous photo of him if you've ever like looked up photos of either Tesla himself or Tesla coils, and that was taken at his lab there. So like Tesla is just doing weird shit in Colorado Springs that really has zero connection to any of the work that he would really be known for at this time in the book. Just for some context of what he's up to when Kit is working as his like lab assistant.
He really was a fascinating man. This sort of boundless, almost creativity in a scientific idea, but completely unchecked by reality because, yeah, he would have these bonkers ass ideas and then just be like, oh, yeah, why not? And just, I'll get all the money from some rich dude and we'll figure it out. It'll happen. Inarguably is one of the greatest scientists of all time, but at the same time had a spectacular number of failures, which is a big part of science. So you kind of have to take that with it. And it would certainly be interesting if some of his more grandiose ideas were feasible. I think especially like the wireless electricity for the entire world. It kind of like what we talked about with Bleeding Edge about the idea of having wireless internet available. Is it a feasible idea? Maybe. It would probably be a really challenging thing to do, but there's no way in hell the powers that be are going to allow something like that would generate enough capital to actually ever happen.
Well, and like I said, I think it was you, Will, who brought up the using the Earth as a electrical like conduit. Just the concept of not being able to understand that doing that would be such a cataclysmic event that that like nothing would recover from that if you managed to actually do it. This is a guy who is doing science in the tail end of the era in which people thought you could have too much blood, or that you should do cocaine to settle down, and just various other sort of insane sort of thought processes. I'd be very curious what his research or findings would have been if you took that intellect in that man and put him in a modern context in which he could more easily understand that something like using the globe as a conduit is not a feasible idea, nor even really possible. I'm just curious what else he would have been able to create during his time alive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a fascinating fragment of history, and I think that's a lot of the impetus behind this book. This was really when modernity, when it really became a phenomenon that justified the artistic movements that named themselves after modernity and the artistic movements that responded to it, which we call postmodern. And so much of that, so much of the absolute batshit way that Tesla's ideas read to us is if in that conversation between Merle and Webb, this kind of starts to make a little more sense. The fact is that a Tesla in the modern day would not survive to the point where he would have enough power to do anything independent. And so much of that is, covered in books like Gravity's Rainbow and The Crying of Lot 49. It's this section which we are about to dip into from Kit's perspective about how he came to appreciate vector mathematics and electrical dynamics. So much of that and so much of what Tesla is talking about is this, not necessarily like the mystical is the well from which ideas are generated, but more that like if you talk to a mathematician, they're gonna, like today, if you speak to a pure mathematician, an academic mathematician, you really get them going, they're gonna say some crazy shit. If you talk to James Watson, the guy who one of the guys who established our modern concept of DNA and published the first paper on its double helix structure, he is a bad man. He is a eugenicist.
Yep.
Like the fact is that in order to be the kind of person who has meaningful ideas, you have to be weird. And if you're fortunate, that means that you write a good book, or you restrain yourself and you publish articles in the scientific academic framework, and you make your stipend with the professor's pay and grants, and you make small pushes towards truth in the long run. But in this time period, this was before the modern academy really existed. Universities go back to 1200 or something, but the idea of publication of scientific experiments, like science at this point, was becoming a concept. Like in the late 1800s, science as a method was being established, and so like all experts in any of their fields have an intuitive, intrinsic, from an outside perspective, mystical understanding of their field, the way that Kit and Tesla view electricity. But those intuitive frameworks for understanding, those deep getting it kind of things, are extremely specific. And so, sure, oh yeah, he had a giant Tesla coil and he burned out a power plant miles away. Why did he think he could make a reciprocating circuit surrounding the globe? Well, because at that point in time, it was less than 30 years after we'd really figured out that you can like stick electrical currents into muscles and make them do things. Like these things were not, like Maxwell's equations are fundamental, not in the sense that they define electricity, but in the sense that they're the stepping stones. They are the Newtonian mechanics to general relativity as to our current understanding of electricity. There was no concept that the reason that the muscles were moving was because of these electrolytes being moved along through the muscles, and that because the muscle was dead, there would be no more recycling, and at some point they would die. It was like, oh, well, the electricity is passing through the life force that is remaining in the leg, and it will disappear. That life force dissipates, and then the leg stops responding to electricity. And so for Tesla, like, sure, he saw man-made lightning strike and probably kill small animals in the vicinity.
Yeah.
And he saw, oh, this is what happens when I accidentally bridge these contacts with my body. That really hurts. But at this point, it was still like, this is a spiritual concept. This is an idea more than it is a physical force that anybody had any concept for. Maxwell was just saying, like, this seems to be how these things tend to work. That turns out that he mostly got it right in terms of, the electricity we deal with day to day. But there is no way, from the standpoint of someone like Tesla, to discern the crazy ideas from the real ones, because nobody thought you could make lightning.
Right.
True.
Yeah, I mean, being able to make lightning back then probably made you feel like you were a god of some description. But I think the other interesting thing that Pynchon has already done once in this book and is now doing twice is illustrating that sort of change that you just sort of described, Will, that kind of movement from like mysticism to a slightly more enlightened understanding, or sort of the building blocks leading to like the modern science that we would eventually have. He did it with the whole conversation on Aether, and the experiments that took place, and how there was this framework of these crazy like aetherists sort of running rabid through the city, that at the end of the day, when they were proved wrong, just kind of disappeared. And like
Mhm.
that kind of, I don't know how you would want to describe it, magic or wizardry or mysticism just kind of dissipates from the world. And I think that that's getting slightly ahead of ourselves. That's where stuff feeds back into the Hollow Earth aspect of this book, and that kind of pressing towards modernity having an effect on the foundations of society and the world at large, and all the rest. It is really clever that he's doing that in a repeating pattern to really nail down to the reader, I'm assuming, having not read this book, what the book itself is basically about.
Yeah, this whole Tesla and electricity and the modernization of the world is very, very crucial to not just these two chapters, but to where everything in the book is kind of heading. And Will brought up a good point, that whole concept of Tesla working with what he had and using the ideas that were available at the time. I mean, yeah, that's essentially what it was. We can look back on it now and see him as a sort of a mad scientist, but yeah, at the time it was just mad. It's like when cavemen started playing with fire. You just you poke it, you find out it hurts if you touch it, and you start experimenting in the most crude and informal ways possible before you can start to hammer out a better understanding of how these seemingly basic things work and how we can harness them.
Yeah. And so kind of moving to less absurd and more realistic science from a perspective of like the vector mathematics and all of that. We go from Tesla to Kit, and we kind of learn that Kit has adopted a perspective as he's gotten older, that the last thing he wants to do is kind of end up in the mines, so to speak, that he wants to go outside of the ground, and unlike his father, is more interested in the way that power is generated and that electricity is generated. That does ultimately still feed back into the mines. He hasn't like fully escaped that industry,
Yeah.
but has escaped sort of the hole in the ground aspect, so to speak. And this is actually like I really like this early section before it gets into the like he can like literally see math.
Yeah.
Like all that's still good, but I really like this section for like a couple of reasons. One, because it feeds into stuff that happens at the end of the chapter as it relates to Kit seeming to have this desire to sort of rise up above his father and to do something more than his father could, being matched with something that is literally rising above his father, in the sense that his father is under the ground and what he is doing is at least above ground, and deals with something on a higher plane because of the ways in which that electricity was generated through like waterfalls. But then also this idea that, once again, if we're going back to the like theme of capital and capitalism and the way in which these things developed and led to the kind of situation we're in, he is viewing this as like an escape from the nightmare that his father dealt with, that we've already read through in relation to the mine owners and the unions and all of that stuff. But at the end of the day, what he's doing is actually just feeding back into the same system. Like, he may think that he has escaped the ground and has escaped the system that his father has been stuck in for so long, but he is still paying back into it, just in a different way, albeit probably a more efficient way that is, going to make it easier for the powers that be or for capital owning class to eliminate job. You're moving it from one category to another. I just think that like thematically, it really showcases especially the folly of Kit's thinking that he articulates at the end of the chapter when his dad is like, you don't understand, like you don't get how these systems work, you don't get what you're signing up for, you don't understand any of this, but because of Kit's belief that he has escaped that mine, that he has escaped the world his father's been living and working in for so long, he has somehow risen above it. It's just such a perfect intersection of the family dynamics, the lack of understanding of like how capitalism would develop, which a reader in the modern era would have a better understanding of, and just that same kind of like father and son dynamic. I think it's really well written, really well articulated, and really well encapsulated by the end of this chapter. It's one of my favorite parts of it.
I have like a footnote to add to that.
Yeah.
On top of the false escape kind of dynamic, what I think is really artful about this chapter is very similar to the chapter from Merle's perspective. Obviously, Kit being a teenager growing up in the Wild West, learning about these fancy new things and getting a job at Mr. Tesla's spark factory. Like he obviously he's caught up in the idea of finding a higher purpose, which I think most people at that point in their life are, or at least are trying to. But much like Merle's story of himself skims over the petty and horrible abuses that come out of his worldview that he enacts on himself and his family, and the fact is the innocent like railroad workers who get caught in the crossfire. Kit probably isn't even thinking like, I'm escaping the mines, I'm escaping working, I'm escaping this capitalist dynamic. He's too young probably to understand any of that, and because I don't think it's there except through the narration and the contrast as readers who have read the previous and the end of the chapter. He's just thinking, I'm learning these things and I don't want to break my back. And there's the notion of escape, but it's the intrinsic subjective escape that understanding electricity, understanding the world more is like an escapist fantasy more than like an active thought of, I'm going to outsmart Foley and Vibe. I'm just here to get a free ride. It's more just like, well, this is a fair deal as far as I can tell, and it gives me the opportunity to spend more time in the clouds.
Yeah, I couldn't have said that better, because you can see in that scene, which we'll get to eventually, where he is talking with Foley and is accepting the deal from Vibe, that there is a very naive part of him that's just like, yeah, this is a great deal. When it is a lot easier to make those decisions when you're young and don't exactly understand how much debt you are going to incur by going to Yale. The concept that he's going to like go to Yale and then like do his 2 years at the Vibe Corporation or whatever, it completely misunderstands what a man like Scarsdale Vibe operates off of the principles of.
Yeah.
Which, we'll certainly get to all of that, but that's a really great way to encapsulate sort of the further implications of how it gets set up here, Will. We get a little bit of detail about like how he got interested in electricity as a concept, but then we get into like his belief in vector symbolism. Did either of you have like research you did on that, or something that you wanted to kind of add contextually to explain what Kit is buying into? I know, Cody, you had some stuff on the specific scientists that he talks about, but did you have anything that you wanted to mention before we get to that on vector symbolism as a concept?
It's over my head.
Yeah, me too. I tried and I couldn't.
I genuinely did. I put some effort into trying to understand it, but essentially I know that electrical engineers still use vector symbolism. It is, I guess, an easier way to describe some of the processes that are used in the electrical field. I know it ties heavily into mathematics that I have no concept of. Suffice to say, it is something that is still being used, and the specific scientists that get referred to here a little bit, Maxwell and Heaviside, had some pretty major roles in that
there's the phenomenon in, I think the name would be the curse of expertise or something. The idea that like a good teacher is not usually the person who's best at actually working with a concept.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that as this book goes further on, using the book as an opportunity to explain these things, I will be able, and in my own studies away from the microphone, be able to act as a bit of a tutor, I guess. But the fact is that as much as I have like a curse of knowledge where I don't even know how to start to explain these things to y'all, I am not an expert. I am not even close to being fluent in these concepts. I'm in a very weird position of knowing enough to see what's going on here, but not knowing enough to be able to explain it to anybody in the broadest, shortest possible way. A long time ago, someone came up with the idea of imaginary numbers to deal with the idea that when you take a square root of a negative number, you get something impossible. And at some point, this cool dude, Hamilton, came up with an expansion of taking imaginary numbers and breaking them into further components so as to deal with translations between 3-dimensional and 4-dimensional frameworks of analysis and physics to convert them into scalar mathematic, arithmetic, and algebra, which is the stuff that most people are familiar with. And you just basically write all of that very convoluted and very difficult to phrase stuff into a variable I, J, and K with a real component. And then very shortly after, because Hamilton was mostly expanding on the work of previous mathematicians, almost simultaneously, a little bit afterwards, some people, Hamilton and Maxwell, figured out the way to completely dissociate the practice of manipulating those Quaternion equations and in generalizing them away from these problematic elements of imaginary numbers, also basically made them infinitely dimensional. You can have a null-sized vector, you can have a one-dimensional vector, you can have a two-dimensional vector, and if anyone's familiar with matrices in a mathematical sense, that is a way of representing vectors in most contexts. Vectors are the way that almost all pure mathematics are conducted these days outside of specific domains of geometry and number theory and like logic, I guess. And in electrical engineering, it's almost all framed in terms of vectors, nested multidimensional vectors. I hope that makes some sense. As we get further into this section, I think there will be some things I can connect that splurg, I don't know what to call that, back into, at least for the purposes of you two, my co-hosts in particular, understanding.
Sure.
And I hope that might be useful for listeners as well. These things are so difficult to work with that these are the reasons that like Tesla had to think of electricity as these mystical forces rather than thinking of them in equational forms, because that's so encumbering that you can't actually do exploratory science with it.
Well, and I think the other thing that you're kind of getting at there with what you mentioned with Tesla, and that what the book is sort of beginning to point to is this kind of replacement of like radical belief in mysticism or religion or other kind of mystical like forces that are beyond explanation with like scientific sort of concepts. You could very easily take what Will just kind of did, which is a very, I would assume, introductory, basic description of something that is very complicated, that takes years at a trade school to probably fully understand, if not a mathematics degree. And you have to put a lot of faith, especially at this time in history, into those things if you're going to utilize them as an underpinning for what you basically spend your life doing, or what you spend your life in the case of Kit, in subservience to. And that these elements are talked about, especially in this chapter, with an almost religious air to it. And between Kit's kind of moment of revelation where he can like see mathematics in the real world, or the real life scientist who has like that moment of inspiration when he's walking through the bridge and like in a frenzy carves an equation into the underside of this bridge. it is something very akin to religious belief, and that these things are eventually going to be and this is maybe where I'm straying into conspiracy corner stuff. These elements are eventually going to be utilized by the powers that be, which now represent people like Scarsdale Vibe or capitalists or major corporations, to create a world in which people are ultimately subservient to those forces. And that has come into the world as a replacement for traditional religious systems that would be directly connected to the monarchy. For a very long time, nobody could read the Bible because it was assumed that it was too complicated for the average person to read. And so they had schools set up where people would go and read this fancy dead language, or they would learn it, and then they would be able to like read it and interpret it, and you had to go to that guy to be able to tell you exactly what any of this stuff meant or what even was in the pages in the first place. And that was used as a system of control societally for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, but was seen as this sort of like, religious enlightenment. Like you would have a moment of sort of enlightenment or awestruck being or whatever from God, inspiration from God, that would lead you to the priesthood. And that is very much how sort of Kit's, I'm going to say, conversion is presented in this chapter, as well as the other guy whose name I can't remember, who carved the equation underneath the bridge. These things have potentially an innocent belief behind it, whether it was a priest just believing in God, or Kit believing in the power of these things that he is invested in to lift himself up out of the mines, lift his family out of the mines, and then like do something good, but that they are ultimately co-opted for something else. They are co-opted for capital. And some of this gets brought up when Tesla starts talking about how much he hates like tithing back to the day, of course, but that there is something mystical about these forces that is immediately used for evil. And even when it is something less explainable in real terms, like vector mathematics are explainable in real terms in the sense of an equation, in the case of Foley having divine revelation through a bullet lodged in his skull, they still lead back to capital. Foley literally is given, stock tips through the bullet in his head. And that is a very obvious link between the mystical and, the expansion of capital. But even in the case of this divine revelation or divine interpretation, the end point is still leading back to capital. It leads him to be in subservience to Vibe in the same way that Foley is. And that it is going to be at this era in which capitalism starts to inflate itself, modernity begins to inflate itself to the point where all roads just kind of lead back to it. And it ends up destroying the very like place that brought it forth, or that sprung it forth. That maybe didn't make any sense whatsoever.
No, it absolutely did.
Okay, but that's really what I pull out of his conversion narrative, and then the immediate next story of Foley's conversion narrative, and how those two things sort of coincide with one another.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to frame it. And if you don't mind, I would like to frame it more shortly than my previous footnote, in a framework that's disabused of the conspiratorial lens, which doesn't take away the reality of that lens. The other way to look at it is that power is self-justifying, and that mathematics and science, these things are descriptive of the dynamics which we observe, within the systems which we develop to model them. In the form of mathematics, quaternions are almost never used outside of extremely narrow circumstances today, but vectors are all over the place. No one's talking about electricity as magic anymore, because we began to understand it. Because of capitalism in its original definition, and in the sense that Marx fleshed out, because power is self-justifying, and because these methods of rational verification of intuition are so undeniable, capital, as a representation of self-justifying power, is able to co-opt those things and influence the ways in which the everyday person, or every person including themselves, is able to perceive the world, because of the fact that the academy has historically been associated with power far more than it's historically been associated with finding truth. As much as the Academy would like to believe itself to be that. Just like the Church, whether the Roman Catholic Church or the Eastern Orthodox or any other form of widespread organized religion would like to believe itself to be seeking God. All they can do is perpetuate their own power in the long run.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it in shorter terms than I was able to.
No, I think what you're getting at is like a very meaningful part of it. Like that's you can't get rid of it. Again, people talk about on the Pynchon subreddit, I've seen more than anywhere else, but I'm sure others talking about this book wherever other people talk about Against the Day. There's the idea that Pynchon clearly has a grudge against vector analysis as opposed to quaternion analysis. And a lot of that distinction is kind of that gap between the conspiratorial thinking, that intrinsic as a person living in the world, and the associations and the feelings you have towards these things inevitably clouding the framework. And that real component, that vector component, just the pure numbers on the paper that mean nothing to anybody.
So, it's always hard when we do this show to move from like big topics to just like, and here's the next thing that happens.
Also this.
And that's where Pynchon is talented.
Yeah,
we are not.
That's very true. So moving from that section, we get a couple of mentions of like actual scientists and mathematicians that Kit has become particularly inspired by. Two of them in particular are mentioned here, where it says Maxwell's Treatise on Electricity and Magnetism of 1873, Heaviside's more recent electromagnetic theory, 1893, and so forth. You said you did some research on these two scientists or mathematicians, Cody. What did you have to share for us?
So, and not to go into, I don't want to spend too much time dwelling on these two in particular, but I also don't want their importance to be missed. I don't remember if the Pynchon Wiki gave him a whole lot of attention, but James Maxwell wrote a treatise on electricity and magnetism, which introduced the concept of vector fields, which, as I understand it, is the velocity of a moving flow in space. Apparently, from what I've read, and that you can get a copy of this online. There is an available copy. I think I have a link to that I can put in the show notes if anyone wants to read it. But it apparently is a very, 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 very challenging read. It is incredibly dry and hard to parse. So if you really want to try and get through a 100-plus-year-old discussion on early electrical theory, it's there. You can read it. And it did play a very, very important role in the understanding of electricity and electrical fields in that time. However, Oliver Heaviside, who's mentioned just right after that in 1893, built out on a lot of what Maxwell had developed as theories. And between the two of them, they were able to introduce what is referred to as the second great unification in physics. The first of those is, just for context, is Newton's unification of gravity. So that gives you kind of an idea of the scale of importance that this has. These understandings led to huge changes, especially in the fields of telecommunication. This is how you were able to have telegraphs that were able to go faster and farther than they had previously, which allowed for quicker, more efficient, farther reaching communication between vast areas of land and eventually overseas, which, when you really start to back out of all this, this is how the world ends up uniting itself. Prior to this, there was so much unknown in the world outside of which you were sort of situated. So you had you would have a good understanding, for the most part, of the area in which you lived, the little bubble in which you lived. But getting information from outside of there was near impossible. Unless you had a ton of money and you were able to travel to other places, you really did not have any concept of what the world was like outside of that small area that you resided. Now, with these huge leaps in technology and in communication specifically, the world can start understanding the rest of itself better. And I think this is central to why this book takes place when it takes place. And we've talked about this before, this idea that Pynchon's novels are all situated at major shifts in the zeitgeist and in the world economy and in the technology of the world. And this is arguably the one that started all of the other ones that came after this. without this buildup of harnessing electricity and being able to utilize it for all the things that we use it for now, the world would not be what it is. And I honestly, I think this is also what's allowed capitalism to really take a foothold and eventually a stranglehold on the world. This is the point at which they could harness this energy that had almost limitless potential, could have been, in theory, distributed for free, not necessarily the way Tesla wanted to do it, but you could have, we could have used this and found a way to make it available and free for everyone in the world to use, but that's not how things turned out. This became a huge money-making concept, and just like the people like Foley, I keep getting characters mixed up, sorry, like Webb, stuck in the mines to harness the energy that we could pull from the mines. Now we have this energy that is much easier to get at, much cheaper to send around, and brings in a much higher profit margin for the people who are in control of it. So now unfettered capitalism can really start to ramp up and shape the world around it.
The only other things that I would have to add on Maxwell is that he is also Maxwell of Maxwell's Demon, which comes up in Crying of Law 49. I tried to read an abstract of the paper that is publicly accessible and couldn't understand that either. So then I found like a summation of the abstract basically, and essentially what that put forth, and the reason why this feeds back into kind of what Will was talking about a little bit ago in regards to the eventual sort of development of like E equals MC squared and like the modern like physics and mathematics that have really put into place our understanding of how things work and the universe around us. What his paper essentially did was put a more or less definitive, as much as you can be in science at that time, end to the aetherist theory, in the sense that what he noticed was that the wave speeds, like the speed at which waves move, exactly matched the speed of light, and that then led him to theorize, which was then later proven, that light was a wave, and so therefore it didn't need a medium to travel through, because they already, I guess, understood how waves were able to travel, which then, would be picked up 40 years later by Einstein and all of the sort of like quantum physicists and all of that, and taken to its more logical conclusions. So that was the best I could do in trying to figure out like what he was describing in that paper that is mentioned. The Pynchon wiki has no information on Heaviside, which I think is interesting. So what did you come up with for that guy?
I mean, essentially just that he was the one who rewrote all of Maxwell's equations. Maxwell was essentially on the right path. He just didn't have, I mean, he had the information he had for the time, but 20 years in mathematics and in science is a lifetime, and a lot of changes can be made in that short amount of time. Essentially, Maxwell laid the ground that Heaviside came in and paved, is kind of the best way to put it.
Which is apparently the ground that a lot of people are still driving over. Like his equations are still utilized. And I think that if you go back to the discussion between Vaco and Webb, where they're like, should we wait until a train comes by that we think that an owner is going to be on, and we can knock out an owner too. At this point, with these equations as a concrete example of the way that mathematics and all of that is being used to push forth capitalism, the owner doesn't need to be on the train anymore. Like he doesn't need to go to the mine and potentially get himself killed to deliver instructions to the mine owner. Nor does he have to send a courier by horse who could be killed, and then the instructions that he has with him are burned. He can just send his sort of new initiatives or instructions to the managers from anywhere. That's like a very concrete example of it, and continues to undermine this conversation of like, is it even important for us to kill a boss? Like, is that really going to accomplish anything? And kind of puts you more in a category of it doesn't really accomplish anything anymore. It's not like in the old days where you could go like assassinate the emperor or whatever, and the next guy who takes over might be different. These corporations are in a sense bigger than that, in that they don't even need to be physically present anymore, which obviously when we get to Foley that's also exactly what he is. He's a representation of Vibe's money in three-dimensional space, essentially, that gives Vibes some kind of protection of not needing to be around. But that also, even if you cut off one head, there's 900 other people who can pick up the stenographer's tool and send a different telegraph.
I have to correct you a bit, Kate, but I'm going to frame it in a way that is directed angrily at anyone who tends to correct us in the future on these kinds of things.
Yeah.
So you got it a little backwards when it came to Maxwell and Aether and wave particle dynamics. Basically, the only thing that you got wrong was he set the stage for the debate over Aether because of the fact that he recognized that these dynamics were both wave-like. That means that the wave has to propagate through something because wave is an analogy. And so the realization later that light behaved as both a particle and a wave is what would then set that to the side. And anyone who heard that mistake and wants to write in, please keep in mind, this is not a history of physics podcast. This is we're talking about books, we're talking about fiction, and yeah, we try to give some helpful context, but we're connecting symbols to symbols here. We're not connecting God to dirt.
Yeah.
Bear with us when we make these kinds of tiny little mistakes and recognize that these books, like, this is a work of a lifetime, and trying to summarize it, even these chapters in a few hours is a fruitless endeavor, and we're doing our best.
I feel like I should cut that out and put it at the beginning of every episode.
just in that exact sentence that he said. But yeah, that's the benefit to having multiple hosts on, because I read a summary of an abstract of a very complicated article and misinterpreted its historical time frame, but Will knew better than that. Yeah,
got to keep ourselves in check.
And I get plenty of things wrong in the physics and math domain, even though I am the relative expert in these conversations. If you are an actual expert, either explain it to a 5-year-old or get over it.
I feel like that should be at the kind of above the lintel of every physics department at a university. Yeah. Either explain it to a 5-year-old or get over it.
Well, I mean, in terms of figuring these things out, the language exists for a reason.
So we get a third scientist dropped here into the text. It says, it had not been a dream, nor the sort of illumination he would someday learn that Hamilton had experienced at Burlham Bridge in Ireland in 1845. This is Kit kind of describing his point of conversion or his point of enlightenment, however you want to put it, where suddenly the math fully makes sense in his head. He groks what he's been studying and can kind of see it in the physical world around him. This is a reference to an actual event that took place, a quote, flash of genius that William Rowan Hamilton had in 1843. As he walked across the mentioned bridge, he discovered and carved the equation I2 equals J2 equals K2 equals IJK equals -1. Whatever that means, I'm not a math professor. And in this equation would lead to the discovery of quaternions, a system of maths that helps calculations involving three-dimensional rotations is the best way that I can think of to describe what I read. Something that would have a lot of use much later for 3D computer graphics, computer vision, robotics, magnetic resonance imagery, and then also crystallographic texture analysis. Anything that you can add to context there, Will?
Just to say, because you didn't use the keyword, that is quaternion theory. That is the breaking up of the imaginary components in complex numbers. That is taking the curious sideways motion of, or literally the idea of motion in mathematics that is represented by negative numbers, and breaking it into something that can be reversed, because negative numbers aren't a real thing. Like, a real number is not a negative number. These are different sets. And Hamilton was trying to figure out a way to take three-dimensional physical problems and make their intuitive workings work in arithmetic. And the way that the story goes is that he figured, since complex numbers can be viewed as two-dimensional coordinates, that the simplest way to do that in reverse, take a three-dimensional system and map it into one-dimensional arithmetic, would be to just expand imaginary numbers. And that's kind of what he did. And that's as much as I can add to this without it just becoming a math podcast taught by an inadequate professor.
So from the description of Hamilton, we kind of go into how Kit and his friend ended up working in Pikes Peak and then eventually for Tesla. I do love this kind of back and forth interaction that they have, where it says, "Hey, Kit, ain't you ready yet? Come on, Kit, we'll camp out up there. There's got to be plenty of jobs just waiting for a couple old hands like us." And then Kit just goes, "Jack, we're 17." Just in very like matter of fact point, which genuinely a possibility that they would be considered old hands at 17.
I was going to say, in 1900,
yeah.
17 is like 48.
17 is you have been working for the past like 4 years.
Yeah, there's no child labor laws.
I know. You can do whatever you want. It's the Wild West as far as labor laws are concerned. And then correctly, Jack understands that means that they are approaching middle age, and he says we need to get to Pikes Peak or bust. And so they find Tesla's operation, and they are able to kind of get introduced to him through Foley Walker, who we learn Foley Walker is quite an interesting individual. He is a representative of the Vibe Corporation that Scarsdale Vibe is the head of, which of course we were introduced to that particular scion of industry, I guess maybe is the best way that I can describe him.
Generous way to frame him.
Yeah, he's a robber baron to a comical degree is really what Pynchon is doing, even more so than the robber barons themselves were comical in their wealth that they had. And he sees something in Kit's sort of understanding of these functions, which were these like equations and mathematics and science that undergirds electricity and electrical systems, and so offers him an opportunity to become a lieutenant of industry, which I think is a really funny name for this program, despite the fact that it is, basically selling yourself into wage slavery, where the Vibe Corporation will send him to Yale and will pay for his college and his books and everything, including a big sweater with a Y on the front of it, which I love that Kit specifically asks for. And then in return, afterwards, he goes and works at the Vibe Corporation, utilizing the degree that they paid for, is sort of the initial offer that is made. And Kit initially doesn't really believe that this is a real thing, doesn't really believe that Foley would have the authority to make this offer to him because of how astronomical the cost of going to Yale probably seemed at that time, especially to someone who grew up the child of like a poor, mining official. And so that's where Foley makes an interesting statement about how he is essentially more real than Vibe is, because he essentially is the representative of Vibe's money, which began when Vibe's father purchased him as a substitute for the Civil War. Now, this is such a fascinating thing because I didn't know this was a real thing until I researched it, but it is. The quote here is, Scarsdale Vibe, having turned the right age for it, had received a notice of conscription. Following the standard practice, his father had purchased for him a substitute to serve in his place, assuming that upon obtaining a properly executed receipt for the $100, $300, why, that would be that. This was a result of the Enrollment Act of 1863, and in fact, famously, J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, Jay Gould, James Mellon, and Grover Cleveland, future president of the United States, all hired a substitute to serve in their place in the Civil War. Now, everyone there other than Grover Cleveland are the infamous robber barons from this era of American history. The initial price of $300. This is kind of hard because you can't utilize a normal inflation calculator to get like money in the 1800s because it was weighed differently at that time, and there was like gold notes and silver notes and all of that. But there are some inflation calculators that you can find that are specifically targeted for that period of American history. It's about $7,550 in today's money is about how much that would cost somebody. However, it only took a year after this program was enacted for that price to go up from $300 to $1,100, and that is about $21,800 in today's money. It is an insane amount of money to pay to keep your son from serving in the Civil War. And just when you think about that amount of money back then, what could you buy with $21,000 in the 1800s? Like a city, probably.
Basically.
It is
buy a human being. That's that much is for sure.
It was an astronomical amount of money. Given that the battle Scarsdale's replacement references when he's explaining kind of this part of his backstory, then it is very likely that he was purchased as a replacement for that latter amount of $1,100 rather than $300. I know that the text says $300, but for Scarsdale to have been, or for Foley to have been present for the battle there, either he lived a significantly longer amount of time than the average life expectancy was of a soldier in the Union Army or the Confederate Army, or Pynchon just wasn't aware of the switch in price at a certain point. It's far more likely that Foley was quote unquote bought for that $21,799 rather than the initial amount, which is just crazy that this was a thing we did.
Yeah.
It was abandoned pretty soon after the Civil War, I think for obvious reasons. But it does create a very interesting sort of dichotomy with which to present Foley as being more real than Scarsdale's money is, because he is a physical manifestation of it. Back during this time frame and even now, that quantity of money isn't something that you just have in a vault somewhere. There's no Scrooge McDuck coin vault likely where all of Scarsdale's money is in the same way that there is not a Scrooge McDuck coin vault that Elon Musk's money is in. And so choosing to specifically have Foley recognize that he is more real than that money is a very intelligent way for Pynchon to go about it. And it goes into a lot of the stuff that he's already kind of been doing through this book. Like there's been sort of this talk of like doubling people potentially having like alternate identities, or having these kind of dualistic nature to them, and that this is a case where there is very specifically two people that represent the same thing. This is one of those cases where you kind of read through a section of Pynchon's writing, and after you finish it, you sort of sit back in your chair and go, damn. And this is definitely one of those moments for me in this chapter.
Yeah, Foley is, and I like that Will brought this up at the top of the episode. Foley is a very interesting character and might be my favorite next to Lou. I'll have to see how I come out of it when we finish everything, but I think the sort of air of intrigue and ambiguity that surrounds him is really, really fascinating. And I think as a character, he is very, as you just mentioned, Gabe, very intelligently written, and is presented in a way that you could almost see him as being more of a real threat than Scarsdale Vibe himself.
Yeah, I guess riffing off of that exact idea, going back to the quaternion and vector stuff, you have this idea that's throughout Pynchon's books, the idea that going to Yale or Cornell or Columbia are not necessarily ways to be educated in whatever you believe you're going to be educated in, but they are ways to indoctrinate young people into being able to self-justify their own position in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And here you have this wonderful example of that stripping out the reality of it, where Foley Walker just goes through life getting vibes, pun not intended in that exact moment, but thank you, Pynchon, for making this book impossible to talk about. He just kind of picks up on what's happening in the world through a magic, mystical ability to, and he knows it's contrived. He knows it doesn't make any sense, but he just knows anyway. And he's able to go into the office and basically say, look, I owe you my life as I am, and you owe me your life in a literal sense. And I can help out your money by giving you hints because I just intuitively know all these things that you, Scarsdale Vibe, have to talk to people to understand. You have to get the telegram saying, oh, the stock price in this has gone up, or, oh, I hear rumors about this new business starting, on the other side of the Rockies. And Foley Walker can just say, this is happening right now. This is what you should do. And that imaginary component of being able to feel what's happening on the other side of the country is a neat, almost intentional correlation with that imaginary component versus the abstracted vector analysis kind of mathematics.
Yeah, so what Will is getting into there is the revelation that he gives that when he suddenly shows up after the war is over, that at the Battle of Cold Harbor he was struck by a Manet ball, which that's a very large piece of lead to just have in your head.
Yeah.
For those who don't know, the Manet ball was a very simplistic way for me to put it, but kind of accurate, is that it was the first sort of bullet in a way that we kind of understand it now. Like, it wasn't in the same way that,
Well, it was more of a conical shape than a ball, which
right.
improved accuracy, improved the reloading. It had the barreling that it was able to use to create spin. But they're huge. They're like the size of the upper part of your thumb.
Yeah, it's again, these things are pretty fast and loose rules wise as far as a conversion, but it's like a 58 caliber bullet that he has stuck in his brain, and that has somehow given him this power of insight into commerce, and like Will is saying, is able to give him kind of tips about companies or stocks without the need to go and speak to like a representative or to be physically present. What he's talking about specifically is the trust era of Standard Oil. So the thing that he's talking about from a perspective of what year this would be happening in was buying shares in Standard Oil's trust. Now, if you go and do research about that, the Standard Oil Trust was different from Standard Oil as a company because Rockefeller understood that the federal government in the U.S. was going to start breaking up monopolies or trusts. Like, they had passed a law and they had appointed a court specifically for the purpose of trying to break up some of these monopolies that had started to crop up in the country. Way too late for it to have much of an effect on the actual like capital owners of them, but it was something. So what Rockefeller did was he basically put the company in a trust that you could buy shares in, so it still worked the way a company did. But my understanding is that at that time in American history, that was a legal distinction different enough that the laws they were attempting to enforce wouldn't be applicable to Standard Oil. Specifically, this trust was set up, like I mentioned, as a way to escape that legislation of breakup. But from 1882, when it was founded, to 1906, before it was finally broken up through a different federal regulation, this trust would pay out $13,941,200,000 in today's money to its trustees at a dividend of about 65.4% from a perspective of how much they bought in at the beginning. The actual trust wouldn't be broken up until 1911, when again another sort of regulation was passed. They entered into court at that in that range of 1906 to 1910, and then finally, like the matter was adjudicated in 1911. It was broken up. Standard Oil remained a fixture of American commerce and oil production for years and years and years after that, but it wasn't at the same level that it was prior to then. So the amount of money that Foley is enabling Scarsdale Vibe to get out of this deal by telling him to buy 500 shares worth is significant. It is probably a significant chunk of Scarsdale's net worth at the time. So the value that he is bringing is massive to the company. If this is an example of just sort of one of the things that this magic bullet stuck in his head manages to kind of tell him. And I think the interesting thing with that is this idea that he is later brought up as potentially being like a socialist by Kit. They have this back and forth where he says, like, well, I went back to Scarsdale because I thought that some reparations were probably owed as a result of me being sent off to war and getting this bullet stuck in my head. And then Kit makes that joke of like, well, yeah, like maybe you'd be entitled to that if you were a socialist. But the funny thing is there's no hint of understanding that Foley doesn't believe that what he's getting is some degree of reparation for this. In actuality, he's put himself into the same position. He was serving in the place of Scarsdale Vibe in the war, and now he's serving Scarsdale Vibe as an employee. And there's no way that Scarsdale is paying him a wage commensurate with getting millions of dollars out of an oil deal in the 1800s. He's probably being treated fairly well and with some autonomy, but at the end of the day, Foley is still a cog in the machine that is Scarsdale Vibe's industry. He doesn't have his own train. He doesn't have his own significant pile of money to his name. Everything is still owned by Scarsdale's corporation. And so it is a further illustration of how he has become sort of the ultimate manifestation of his money. Not just in the sense that he is the one responsible for generating a significant quantity of it, but that he is incapable of escaping serving it. The only purpose he has at this point is to continue to expand that. And this is really something that would only get worse the longer that capitalism expanded and the longer that modernity expanded. There is no worker currently in existence that isn't having their surplus labor value robbed from them, right? Like it's hard to calculate exactly what that surplus labor value is, But in the case of a man like Foley, he is that concept of the robbery of surplus labor value and allocation of value per employee taken to its most logical conclusion, in that you can actually calculate the amount of money that he has given to Scarsdale's corporation.
Well, in one instance that we know of.
In one instance, yeah, exactly. Presumably multiple instances after that. If they were written out, you could do some degree of calculation as far as what they'd be worth. But at the end of the day, he is, for some reason, convinced that because he represents this larger figure or this, pile of comical, amounts of money, that he is somehow being paid back for that, which is a representation of how a lot of people have historically felt about their work underneath, a capitalist organization in the economy. This idea of, Starbucks uses it, for example, by trying to get their baristas to believe that they are serving something greater, right? That they are lucky to wear a green apron and create this third place, right? But that the baristas themselves probably generate about $87 worth of revenue an hour, but are paid on average like $12.50, right? So it's a case where he is just as deluded to that, but to a significantly more intense degree because of the fact that he's generating significantly higher amounts of revenue. It's just it's again a situation where Pynchon is taking something to its most logical conclusion, but is doing so in a way that is so obviously spelled out to the reader that you can follow back the math that he's tracing to something just as relevant now, right? There's no magical bullet speaking to anyone's head for stock tips that I'm aware of, but the principle
Ball.
of there you go. But that principle of employment is still very much in place with the average modern worker in the United States or really any industrialized nation.
In a weird way, I think Foley kind of created his own sort of Damocles situation here. He, in a sense, kind of showed his hand too early and stuck himself into this deal that he can provide almost endless capital to Vibe, and we'll never see anything close to a return on what he's providing him. You know, like you said, he's always going to be paid just enough to keep comfortable. But Vibe is also the kind of person that has the sort of power that he can hold over Foley, to where Foley knows that there is no getting out of this. He can't just say, "I'm done, I'm leaving," because he'll get killed.
Yep.
Vibe's the kind of guy that can make a body disappear pretty easily, and especially in the late 1800s, that's not terribly hard to do. Whether or not he genuinely believes that he is contributing this value to what he's doing, I think that's kind of up for debate. I certainly think he may have deluded himself into that, and that's his way of sort of justifying doing what he's doing. Because otherwise, he has taken what is essentially an opportunity to make himself into a Scarsdale Vibe. You know, he has this ability to know what money making capabilities are out there, and could take advantage of it over a long enough period of time. With starting with a small investment, snowballing that, could have really blown himself up to that and created a form of competition against Vibe. But I don't know that he had the foresight to see, if I put myself into this situation, I'm going to be stuck here forever. And maybe he's fine with that. We don't really know. But he had the ability, at least, to really make a lot more of himself than he's allowed himself to become. Which makes me wonder, if he's trying to kind of work something on the inside, and, thought maybe at first, like, I can bring down the whole structure from inside with enough time, and just never panned out, and now here he is.
You brought up the sort of Damocles. I'd like to cut the Gordian knot. two things. I'm very proud of that one.
You should be.
But no, so first of all, he introduces himself after Kit says only the magnanimous Scarsdale Vibe, or whatever Scarsdale Vibe is mighty self, can guarantee these things. And that segues into Foley saying, "I am he." Which is, it's just a thing people say. It's just a meme at this point. It literally means he is saying, I am this other first person, I am another, in a way that is inextricable from the I. He was shot in the head with a bullet in his left frontotemporal lobe. The science of it wouldn't be dug into for after the setting of this conversation with Kit, another 30 years or so. That's an ice pick lobotomy location right behind the eye on the left side of the brain. And what that does when someone has a lobotomy in that sense is almost across the board, they lose an intrinsic sense of self. They are without impetus. The idealized form of the lobotomy, as like initially published before the ice picks got involved, before it just was like, oh, is your wife bitching at you? Let me stick a piece of metal in her brain. When people were genuinely trying to help people and just experimenting with people with brain damage and stuff, they found that when done properly, a leucotomy, as it was called at the time, basically annihilates that sense of self without taking away their ability to do functional things. You can tell them to do something, in this idealized form of a lobotomy, which almost never actually happened. And if they think it makes sense for them to do that, they'll do it. And so imagine Foley Walker's laying there half conscious, and he's just absorbing all this information, and all he has in his identity as this young man who gets essentially conscripted, but with a check to substitute for Scarsdale Vibe, is go be Scarsdale Vibe. He is going to be him. He has this access to all these secret knowledges, and sure, he could snowball it himself, but he doesn't exist anymore. There's no there. There's no person. There is just this automaton of being whose sense of self has been replaced with this intrinsic connection to the market. And so why would he go snowball it? He doesn't want to get rich. And he knows who he is. He identifies himself as Foley Walker. He's aware. He has conversations. He's relatively charming and clever. He goes and he talks to Scarsdale and he says, I was your replacement in the war. I'm going to do this for you. Probably because there's nothing else for him in the world. There's nothing that he wants to do, because there is no want. There's no, like in a psychoanalytic framing, there's no superego. There's barely an ego. There is just an id and the capacity of the superego. There's just kind of this, he is a structure around which the person has been annihilated. And so he has this ability, and on the symbolic level, sure, he's the Foley Walker to the Scarsdale vibe. He is the person who does the dirty work. He's the person who gets the deals done. He's the person who figures these things out intuitively, while Scarsdale vibe wears the fancy suits and walks around with the globe in his hand. Mm-hmm. He is the guy who gets things done, and that is a purpose, and that is the only purpose he could possibly have, because his life was signed away by his father when he was, 16 or 17 years old.
That is excellently stated. I do want to make sure that I mention that I'm pretty sure my favorite phrase that's ever been said on this podcast now is the idealized form of the lobotomy before the ice picks got involved. That might be my favorite thing that anyone has ever said on this show, but I don't want that to undercut just how insightful what you just said was, Will.
Well, yeah, I mean, I implore everyone to dig into the history of the lobotomy, because it's a fascinating thing, and it's really a horrible part of American and European history that we've kind of swept under the rug. It was originally, the idea was, we're going to cut out the connections in the brain that make people irritable, so that they can just get on with their lives without wanting to kill themselves or wanting to harm other people. There was an ideal. It wasn't just like this totalized figure of misogyny, which it turned into.
Well, I think too, like historically, as crazy as it sounds, that idealized version was more humane than what they had been doing up to that point.
That's true.
Like, and one show that I would highly recommend everyone watch that almost nobody watched and was on TV, so it got canceled, is called The Nick, which is about the development of like pre-modern medicine, kind of like the very beginnings of like surgery and surgical procedures, and like thinking that there wasn't as much of a mystical element to the human body. It takes place in 1901. And is based on actual like surgical developments that occurred through a couple of different like key medical figures. Like they combine a few people into like the main character and all of that. So it is a fictionalized narrative, but it is representing the development of actual science. And there is a portion of the show that is dedicated to the insane, like inhumane stuff that they would do, mostly to women, to your point, Will, about it just being weaponized for the purposes of misogyny.
Yeah, it's one of those tricky things where like, is it really more humane to, instead of throwing someone in a pit and feeding them gruel and, chaining them to the wall so that they don't kill themselves to escape, is it more humane to take out the value-finding aspect of a human? Who knows?
Yeah,
let's find out.
Let's get rid of the intrinsic, the intrinsicity of the humanity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, is that humane? I don't know. The motivations totally work.
In this section of the story in which Foley is relating how he ended up in the situation he is to Kit, he does make a mention to, what the old Indians out west believe, that if you save the life of another, he becomes your responsibility forever. This is also a phrase that's in Inherent Vice. On page 363, Doc and Coy are talking, and it says, Doc listened to him breathing for a while. You know what the Indians say? You saved my life, now you've got to... Yeah, some hippie made that up. These people, man, don't know nothing. Cody, you did some research on this particular proverb or line, yeah?
I intended to do some research on this proverb. I went into it fully thinking like, okay, I'm going to find the philosophy that this stems from and see where it traces its roots back to. And I'm thinking initially that it's some, as it mentions, it's some Native American ideology or concept that ties the spirit of someone to a person whose life they saved. When I couldn't find anything there, I thought, okay, well, maybe knowing Pynchon, maybe it's like an Eastern philosophy kind of thing. It traces back to like Buddhism or something like that. No, it's from the show Kung Fu with David Carradine. The only instance I can find of that phrase being uttered at any point in time was an episode of Kung Fu called The Last Raid from April 26, 1975. And there's a line in there that someone says, what Kane says, quote, whenever someone saves another's life, he's responsible for him forever. That's where this comes from. So I found that utterly fascinating, and I can't imagine there was nothing on the Pynchon wiki about this at all, other than the mention of it being an inherent vice. I'm just imagining Pynchon watching old episodes of Kung Fu and going, hell yeah, I like that concept. That's pretty badass. And making it something out of it. I mean, look, we got Foley Walker out of it. So
there's almost a part of me that wants to believe that he genuinely thought it was a real saying, and so he included it in this book. And then at some point between this book being finished and Inherent Vice being finished, he
found out.
Wait a second. He was probably rewatching episodes of Kung Fu, and then
it entered the public lexicon so much that like when I was researching it, it was just a bunch of like feedback of people quoting it like it's on some motivational poster or something like that. And so that's probably more likely exactly what happened. And then he finds out 10 years later, well, I guess it came from here, so what the fuck do I know?
That honestly might be the greatest contribution to the world that the TV show Kung Fu ever made.
Right. Don't bother going and watching the whole series. It's episode 57. If you have to watch it, just watch the one. The show's not that good.
It's not.
Just one last addendum, going way back at this point to the Standard Oil tip. The insightful part of the historical context you gave, Kate, in terms of the meaningfulness of that interaction, is that the value of trust at that time and the reason it was able to be formed in the way it was to exploit the laws in the way it was, is that it was a secret operation at that time. It wasn't something that like even Scarsdale Vibe, as in the know as he would have been, wouldn't have had access to because it was so secret and Masonic to go back to the framing of Mason and Dixon.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a line in the Pynchon wiki about how like, like it's not really secret. Like people knew about Standard Oil at the time. It's like they did not know about that. like what you're saying, Will, as far as the money generation aspect. Like people had heard of Standard Oil. They had a large presence in Ohio, to harken back to another place that Pynchon has already talked about in this book. But yeah, the specific trust in its money making means it was very much not public knowledge.
Yeah, it doesn't really work if it is.
If it does, like that kind of defeats the purpose of the limited shareholders getting a massive payout. I do love that before Kit is sort of convinced that the offer from Foley is real, he says, with that kind of personal faith, I could make a whole lot more money like preaching and handling snakes, which is a bit of an anachronism that kind of like prophetic preaching didn't sort of happen until much later, but it's just, I don't know, it's just a line that made me laugh quite hard. Really, the next kind of phase of their conversation is him being reeled into accepting this deal, right? And that this has a feeling of just sort of how easy it is to make a deal with the devil, right? He is seized upon because there is potential in him, and they are able to sort of feed that back into him by saying like, hey, you already love this thing you're working on. Why not do it without having to worry about paying your bills? And when you're 17, whether that was half your life or just the beginning of your life, the consequences of accepting a deal like that feel so far away to you that you can't quantify how long you're going to have to work for Scarsdale Vibe for. It's entirely possible that while he's working for Scarsdale Vibe, he's receiving no money because they're saying that he's paying back the money they already paid him, so to speak. Like, he really knows almost nothing about this deal beyond the concept that he will go to college without having to worry about the bills and that he will have a job afterwards. The rest of it, he has zero idea. And it's all sold to him as this idea that, like, you will be able to do what it is that you want to do for the rest of your life. You'll belong to that band of adventurers into the aether and its mysteries to become Por Vida, one of Doc Tesla's boys. Is a phrase that is listed here after he goes and sees that the money is good at the bank teller. And then when he signs the deal, he says, after I finish college, I come to work for Mr. Vibe till the debt's paid off. That's right. there's no mention of how long that's going to take. There's no mention of what the specifics of that are, and he doesn't know to ask.
Yeah.
He is approaching it with the naivety of a child who is being promised the world and is willing to go along with that because he doesn't know any better, but he also has this underlying current of wanting to do better than his dad. And he probably would understand that if he asked his dad what he thought about it, the answer would not be what he wanted. It wouldn't give him the sense of like, personal achievement or gratification that he's looking to get out of it. Because of course, when he tells him what he's already done at that point, his dad is like, no, you need to do anything else, and is actually speaking sense to his son, but he's so single-mindedly dedicated to this pursuit of leaving the mines for good, of rising above it, but also having that single-minded focus on something he does genuinely love, that it is able to cloud his decision making. And that is really one of those aspects of capitalism that I think a lot of people understand more so now, but was less evident then, in the sense that people go to college, and they go to college if they're lucky and they know what they want to do for the rest of their life, to study something that they're really interested in, that they find exciting, and they have a great time doing that while at university, and sometimes those are the most exciting like years of their life. And then as soon as they get a job, it just becomes a job, and it becomes something that is sort of a betrayal of how you thought it was going to go. Because at the end of the day, within this kind of an organization of the economy, within this kind of an organization of society, your time is literally money. And you can't waste that because it is being seen as an opportunity to earn by the powers that be, and by a development of that capital T they. And so you can't be allowed to sit and just work on the things you're interested in like you might with a graduate thesis in college. That doesn't work anymore because you're having to pay back that investment you got in college, whether it's to a company like Scarsdale Vibe or whether it's to the federal student loans you took out, for a more sort of modern example of that. It's just an excellent piece of writing that is a bridge point between the beginning of the chapter and then also is followed up again by the end of the chapter. It's the stuff in this chapter that I love the most.
I think in his mind, he's doing what his dad wanted him to do, but it's a very myopic way of looking at that. I think he's looking at it as, I have this opportunity where I don't have to worry about money for a while. I've grown up my whole life having to worry about money, and is there going to be food on the table? And my dad gave us this lecture all the time about making the most of your opportunities, and I never wanted to be stuck in the hole that he's stuck in, literally and figuratively. So this is my opportunity to climb out of that and make something of myself. And he obviously doesn't see the long term that's going to come of this, that Webb tries to explain to him later, and that has been trying to explain to him for since he was a child. But he's and I think this is kind of the folly of that age of the going off to college and thinking that you've got the world figured out at 17 years old. It's a heartbreaking thing to watch him do, because as a reader, we know what the sort of bear trap that he's walking into at this point, right? So it's hard for us to watch this character take these steps towards inevitable, almost indentured servitude is what it's going to come out to be at the end of the day. And it's even more heartbreaking when we get to the end of the chapter and we see the damage that this causes between him and Webb, this sort of irreconcilable schism that this drives between the two of them. It's beautiful writing, and it's part of what makes this book so special to me is his hand at writing these familial relationships and the way that they're kind of going through the story.
Yeah, and what I really like about it is there's the recurring motif in Webb's earlier chapter where he's thinking, I don't know if I would have made this commitment to the cause of the worker if I'd known what it would cost. And it's I don't really think Pynchon is saying that these are equivalent outcomes, but I think it's pretty clear that he is definitely saying that regardless of the path you choose, there are plenty of excuses to find regrets in your choices.
Yep.
And either way, you're gonna be compromising yourself somehow. Webb, it's with his family, and it turns out kind of the same deal with Kit. At least, even if you can blame it on Webb's refusal to compromise his principle of saying, if you take this deal, you're out. It's still Kit chose to do it.
Well, I think too, to a certain extent, this gets into this Pynchonian idea that we've talked about a lot in Bleeding Edge, and so far in this book too, of this like karmic debt, that like everything you do incurs some degree of karmic debt. Like the line that Foley has where he says, might have been from observing how Mr. Vibe and other notable ransomed souls of his era had been left free to behave, right? Like that speaks to a certain level of like karmic debt that Foley feels he is owed because of Scarsdale's actions, right? There is a certain karmic debt that Webb seems to be speaking to from the perspective of, you know, if I had known what my actions were going to result in, maybe I wouldn't have done that. If I knew the price of that, right? Maybe I wouldn't have done that. Even if you're fighting a just war, so to speak, like probably the closest thing to a just war that's ever been is World War II, right? Like there was absolutely a reason to go fight that war to stop the Nazi regime and end the Holocaust. But there is still an extreme karmic debt associated with killing people. And like maybe you can make a statement that those deaths were justified in the sense that if it was what needed to happen to stop, you know, a genocide, then that was the case. But there's still a weight to that. There's still a weight to Webb choosing to take the life of a company owner or, you know, a mine operating official or any of that. These things are prices you pay for everything, right? Like Kit is choosing to follow after his dreams at the expense of his family, right? And there is a debt associated with that. And again, I don't know because I don't know what the rest of this book is like, but it seems as though that is a sort of constant theme through this book so far, right? Like there is the unknown karmic debt for whatever Lou Bass Knight did to become the upstate downstate beast, right? There is a karmic debt associated with I don't think it was Lou, but the other character who mentions like the sadness of being looked at differently by the Chums of Chance, if I remember correctly, and like losing that prior association that he had. I don't remember exactly who that was in reference to, but there is debt to everything, right? Like the debt for becoming a photographer and the way that he became a photographer may have cost him his wife, and you know the familial unit that he had created, right? Like there is a process associated to all of that, and something that you need to pay, whether you're doing something good or bad, to again do some intertextual criticism, if I am allowed, on a show that is about literary criticism. I think that is what it is that I find so compelling about Nicholas Windust's character, because like yes, he is a piece of shit. Yes, he is rough, if not abusive, in the sex scene that he is involved in that book. Yes, he is a representation of like the State Department's campaign of terror that it has waged on the global South for 70 years or whatever. But he is also one of the only Pynchon characters that I can think of that is aware of the karmic debt he owes to the universe. And
yeah, that's true.
And actually like did something to try and repay that debt through the sort of marriage to his wife from South America. I don't remember her name right now. And like creating a shelter for at least one of the people affected by the actions that he was involved in when he was going on the dirty war campaigns of the Reagan administration. That's what I find so compelling about his character, because so often like the tragedy inherent to this aspect of Pynchon's writing is the unknown element of it, or the lack of understanding of sort of the implications of it. But he's the only one that I can think of who seems to have some acknowledgement or understanding of that, and is working to, at least in part, repay some of that. Not really related necessarily to the text, but just another thing about that book that I particularly appreciate. Do we have any thoughts that we want to share? I'm sure we all do, on this conversation between Kit and Tesla, where he kind of goes back to the lab and talks to Tesla about how there's no time in the day and that there's always things in the way of what he actually wants to do, something that Tesla agrees with.
I've got thoughts and feelings. Not sure any that are really worth.
I guess I can kick it off if you want, Will, and then maybe you can find a bridge off of what I took notes on.
Yeah, if you've got something to say, go for it.
The Pynchon wiki, and what really kind of like kicked off the observations or the thoughts on it that I had, is that what they're describing off of this back and forth, and maybe it would be good to actually just read out the dialogue.
Oh, sorry, I was looking for... This toroid is the wrong shape, said Tesla. Come, look at this a moment. Kit had a look. Maybe there's a vector solution. How's that? We know what we want the field to look like at each point, don't we? Well, maybe we can generate a surface shape that'll give us that field. You see it? Tesla have inquired, looking at Kit with some curiosity. I see something, Kit shrugged. The same began to happen to me also at your age. Tesla recalled. When I could find the time to sit still, the images would come. But it's always finding the time, isn't it? Sure, always something, chores, something. Tithing, Tesla said, giving back to the day. Not complaining about the hours here, nothing like that, sir. Why not? I complain all the time. Not enough of them, basically.
So, like, the Pynchon wiki writes that this positions Tesla as being against the day. This is obviously like a very clever, utilization of the title, which I tend to agree with based upon like sort of the notes that I took here. So I'm just going to sort of read them, and maybe they'll make sense, maybe they won't. By his resentment of the tithing towards the day that he has to engage in, it positions him, quote unquote, as against the day, in the sense that there is something that is always in the way of the divine revelation that he has experienced with science. Getting back to the concepts that I had spelled out earlier about how you may have innocent reasons for getting involved in a religion in the priesthood, and you may have innocent reasons for utilizing your divine revelation for science or mathematics or electronics or whatever, for pursuing after those dreams. But that there are inherently things in life that get in the way of that, right? Whether it's chores or what have you, in what the ellipses may represent there in their back and forth. And this sequence sort of between him and Kit, I feel like, is the closest explanation we may get to what the day represents at this point in the book and what people are against as a result of being against the day. Both of them acknowledge, because they have this sort of shared spiritual awakening as it relates to mathematics or science or electricity or whatever. Both of them acknowledge that to think clearly and be revolutionary in their advances in electricity and presumably anything, what they need is time. They need time to be able to sit and think and discover. Yet, as the world moves ever further towards modernity, as capitalism continues to expand, there is always an expanding amount of work, responsibilities, or things to do, right? Like, if you create a electrical power line, suddenly now that needs to be serviced, and then there needs to be people at the substation, and there needs to be people at the endpoint, and there, you have these expanding responsibilities and jobs that come as a result of that. Essentially, the further into modernity and the further into these discoveries you get, the further away from Ludditism, to harken back to the article that I keep referring to over the course of our discussions here. It never gets easier. Like, what you have to do in a day continues to expand. It never lessens. It only grows. So importantly, this is also true of capitalism and the relationships between commerce and employment. Capitalism and employment literally monetizes your time. It monetizes the hours and half hours and minutes of the day. You're paid by hour. You can break that down to what you're paid per minute, so to speak. A fact which, when taken to its logical conclusion, means that everything you're doing has to be worth something of value. Otherwise, it's seen as a loss. And then when you run out of ways to exploit that from a perspective of the number of hours of work you can do in a day, or the amount of value you can get out of somebody's labor by adding a machine to lessen the load that's responsible, which helps you cut jobs, or so on and so forth, the last thing you have to control is the amount of money you pay someone in an hour, or the amount of people you have working within any given hour. So you continue to crank this dial as far as you possibly can, because underneath that system of the economy, you need to continue having the line go up forever. And if it doesn't keep going up, then somehow you failed, even though this is an inherently self-destructing way to organize something, because you run out of ways to squeeze that monetization of the day or the time out of it. And it becomes nearly impossible to quantify the value of sitting still and thinking, because it isn't seen as actively engaging in anything pushing towards profit, even though possibly, if given enough time, Tesla could have come up with the wireless electricity system that Scarsdale Vibe is so worried about in the beginning of the book. And that would have been a major advance forward in technology. And that maybe would have recouped, in capitalistic terms, the amount of time it would have taken for him to think it up. But you'll never know, because it requires an investment return now. It requires you to be able to speak to what you are doing to earn money now. And if you're just sitting and thinking and avoiding this sort of constant need to do something else in your day, then you can't account for the amount of money that you've lost. Or at least that's what someone in a capital owning class is going to assume. So people like Tesla or potentially Kit can get an investor to subsidize that time. They're like, hey, I need, this amount of money to do this thing, and that may be worth this amount of money in real dollars if it works out. And so you may get an opportunity to have that time to sit and think, but it still comes with the eventual obligation of repaying that investment in some way. There needs to be some way to quantify the money that was given. Tesla, lied about what he was using the funds for when he set up his power station in Colorado, and he did luck out in the sense that his investor died in the Titanic. But he would have, at some point, if that guy didn't die, have to account for what he spent all that money doing. And he would have had to have explained that rather than working on the wireless system, he was using it to develop a theory that he was communicating with Martians. And that would have been seen as a complete loss of revenue. And then who knows what would have happened if that guy had stayed alive instead of boarding a particular boat in the early 1900s. And so, thusly, I think that what we can see Pynchon going towards here is, if we're looking at the day as kind of a insert for capitalism or modernity, or the advances being made in science and technology, and the doing away of religion, or the majesty of creation, and how that ties in potentially with the Hollow Earth stuff in the next chapter, we end up with kind of this idea that in the same way that colonialism, which he's tackled in other books, harms both the colonizer and the colonized, capitalism actually harms both the capital-owning class and the working class, in the sense that, yes, you may have a significant amount of money in the capital-owning class, but you also have to justify that money by returning profits. You have to also do dumb shit to make it seem like you are worth that money, or that you are going to continue generating money. Because even if you're a CEO, you answer to the board of directors, and the board of directors represents the shareholders, and that's who they have to respond to. And so there are always these escalating demands that cut both ways. And instead of allowing the actual engines with which ingenuity or invention can come from to have the time to work, when you put them in an explicit system that requires them to generate an output significantly matched to the investment, all you do is end up with shittier and shittier products. Why is it, that the stuff we have now sucks so bad in comparison to the furniture or the infrastructure of 200 years ago? Because the time it took to make that stuff is no longer quantifiably worth that investment in the modern era, because you can sell 3 times as much of a different thing at less the cost if you just cut some corners. I mean, this goes back to Byron the Bulb, like one of the most recognizable symbols of Pynchon's fiction. A light bulb that was meant to to burn forever. But instead, you need to undercut the value of something to make more value in the eyes of a short-term capitalistic mindset. That may be like a lot of bullshit to pull out of like just a conversation between two people about how there's not enough hours in the day, but that is really what I thought most of, especially in conjunction with the fact that in one chapter you have sort of a illustration of three different people's divine revelations as it relates to science or commerce or mathematics or technology that all end up just leading back to the same place of that expansion of capitalism and that expansion of commerce and industry and modernity, and how that is eventually just going to come back and bite them in the ass in different ways, whether it be fully not having a personal identity beyond his employment, or by the fact that Kit is selling himself into wage slavery by accepting this deal, or that the equations that quaternions would led to all of the different sort of expansions in technology and science and computing and all of that we've already talked about, which has a whole other element wrapped up into it. That's at least what I felt. It's sort of reading through that and then combining that with all the information already in the chapter at this point.
I think you nailed it in terms of kind of expanding that in the context of the discussion of capital and productivity in an economic sense. I think it's a little more diffuse than that. Generally, sure. You get so many hours in the day, you wish you had more because, at the end of the day, you think, I meant to do more. I think everything you said is in there. I think that's all very relevant. So thank you for explaining it.
From there, Kit goes back and speaks to his father and tells him what it is that he's decided to do. And his father, predictably, for the kind of man that he is, reacts very negatively to this information and basically just tries to tell him, no, you're not doing that, even though he understands somewhere deep inside that he can't actually keep his child from doing it and actually keep his child from going down this path. He can, as sort of the old union hand, can tell where this is headed. He understands that, an offer of an employment contract is not an offer of all the it is meant to be, so to speak. He's also a bit additionally paranoid in the sense that he thinks that it's to get back at himself for all of his organizing work that he's done, which is probably not the case. I don't think Foley is aware of who Webb Travers is and is choosing to like recruit his son as a way to punish the father for his work in the Colorado labor wars and all of the stuff that we've already talked about. But it is, to get back to the point, sort of a karmic cycle in that, he did this one thing for the rights of workers and for laborers, but his lack of ability to, properly raise his kids or properly treat his wife or, whatever may be the case, led to his son going in the exact opposite direction of what he had hoped. And it's a really, really hard moment for me to read. And I'll be a bit vulnerable here in saying that, like, as I mentioned at the top of the show, I have a very difficult relationship with my father. I'll be honest, don't like him. Don't care for him. He's a very abusive individual, and specifically the lines that Webb has here, where he reflects back on his own relationship with his father and how he had hoped that he wouldn't do the same thing, and that he had hoped to have a better relationship with his son than his father had with him. It hits really close to home because I know that my dad felt the same way. That he had a really bad relationship with his dad and hoped to do better with his kids. He had 3 daughters, so there's no direct son comparison there, but certainly from a perspective of not wanting to have that broken relationship with his children. And in some, I don't know, call it karmic justice, call it whatever you want to call it, that cycle just perpetuated. And so, like, this is certainly a case where reading Pynchon's prose as it relates to very real family dynamics is a case where, like, it hits particularly close to home for me, and it's very effective in its prose, where I feel like even if you weren't in my situation where you have a very concrete example of like what Webb is articulating, you can still understand that this is a very common thing that happens, and that it is probably one of the worst things I would imagine that a parent could experience. More great character writing, more evidence of the fact that Pynchon is very capable of writing incredibly warm passages about families and relationships between parents and children, but is also just as capable of writing very difficult but realistic connections that the families may have, or circumstances that may lead them to have no connection.
I grew up in a house that was very much it's my way or you're gone kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so seeing this and that sort of ultimatum that's given, even though you can tell like it is hurting Webb to do this, it's not stopping him from doing it. He's so dug into his position and his belief that this is the wrong choice for Kit. And whether or not it is, I think that's where the challenging part is because, you know, as a parent, do you know more than your kid? Like, yeah, you have more life experience and you have more context for how things might play out than Kit is willing to look at. But at the same time, you have to allow that autonomy. You have to allow, especially a 17-year-old, to start to make their own choices. And it should never be this binary of, if you don't do what I want you to do, then that's the end of our relationship. But that's the reality of this time. And not even just this time. Like, this is still a thing that happens. I mean, obviously the two of us have dealt with it. It is a cycle. And it shows in, like you said, in Webb's recollection of his relationship with Cooley and how he has this mindset of like, I'm not going to become that. I'm not going to become that. But here we are. And this is exactly what he is. And and again, this is why I wrote that karmic balance underneath that paragraph where he's thinking back to his father. It's not just the, you know, having to weigh out the scales of his work for the unions and to help the working class that took him away from his family. So now he's balancing on that. He's also paying for the sins of his father in a literal sense. He's passing that on to the next generation. And I'm sure if you trace it back far enough, his father had the same situation, had a father who was just like that. He had a father who was just like that. It's a painfully recurring theme in fraternal relationships. And it's one that is very, very, very hard to break.
I would like to thank both of y'all for being so vulnerable. The personal relating to it, you know, is what makes it great. But you guys both also, through that relating, were able to kind of do a pretty good just breakdown of what's going on dynamically in that scene.
The other thing that needs to be mentioned too is it's not just the way that Webb handles it, but also the way that Maeva handles it, because they're oceans apart in the way that they're dealing with this situation. And
absolutely,
the final page of this chapter when Maeva takes Kit to the train station and has her parting conversation with him. I just want to read the last few lines through the last paragraph. I'll never see you again. No, she didn't say that, but she might have. So easy. A look from him. Any small gesture of collapse from his careful young man's posture back into the boy she wanted, after all, to keep. That is fucking heartbreaking. Yes, she's handling this a lot more maturely than Webb, for sure. But it's just as painful for her because she's letting her child go and knows that it may, whether or not it's going to work, it doesn't really matter. He's leaving. And especially in this time in history, he's probably not coming back. There's no, you know, he can't just get a car and drive home. He can't just catch a flight and fly home. This is it for the most part in these kind of relationships at this time. And not only is she losing Kit, but her marriage is clearly dissolving as well. And this is one of those, you know, stay together for the kid situations. And when the last kid's gone, what's left? So there's a lot of layers that are going on here at the same time. And it's really, really hard.
Yeah. Well, and to add another layer to that metaphorical lasagna, like even if Kit does become wealthy enough to like return home or does end up coming back, it's not going to be him anymore.
No.
Not the him that she is speaking to right now. Like this is the last time she will see that child of hers, and when or if she sees him again, not only will he be an adult man, but he will be an adult man in servitude to something that he does not understand, that he's putting himself in servitude to. And that is inevitably going to change him into something else. I mean, we don't know if he's going to be better off or worse off for it. My inclination be worse off, but he certainly is not going to be the child that she loves, right?
Yeah.
She's still going to love him, but it's not going to be that kid anymore. That last line there is like particularly devastating because yeah, she may literally never see him again, but even if she does, she's not going to see him anymore. He'll be a completely new man, so to speak, just by virtue of aging. Yeah, I love this simplicity but complexity with which Pynchon writes about a lot of this stuff.
Mhm.
It's very impressive and is written in a way that is eminently understandable and also for a lot of people is very relatable.
That whole bit is kind of summarized in the church hat description.
Mm-hmm.
She was wearing her church hat. Church having been conducted often is not out under the sun. The old maroon velvet had picked up some years of trail dust and grown sun-faded along in many miniature ridge tops. Wasn't too long ago that he'd still been too short to look down and notice that. And that, in those two sentences, in a very diffuse way, kind of get at that entire dynamic between Webb and Kit.
Mm-hmm.
And that would probably be my favorite quote of these two chapters.
It's an incredible one.